I'm going to talk a little bit now about some of the ways that sculpture is classified. So very basically, within the umbrella of sculpture, there's quite a lot of different categories actually. And I think in contemporary art context, you can go into the world of installation and you go into the world of performance art, and all of that constitutes some sort of three-dimensionality which falls under the umbrella, loosely under the umbrella of sculpture. However, for your purposes, I think it's really good to understand just two categories, and that is the additive processes and the subtractive processes. Now, additive processes means exactly that. You're adding to something. Okay, so you're either making it with your hands and you're adding to it. And within that, you get things like assemblage and construction. And these are methods that have been used, popularized mainly during the 20th century. And you can go back 20th century, probably even in the late 19th century as well. So about 1860s, 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, you had artists experimenting with three-dimensional assemblage and construction. Not to the extent that it happened in the 20th century, because that's when things really got interesting and artists were looking at the environment and trying to create stuff from the objects and materials that they found in their immediate context. So I want to talk a little bit about construction first, or assemblage, and I want to talk a little bit about the additive processes. So when we're talking about additive, you can constitute your armature making, your wire armature making under the additive process. So here are a few examples here where one of my students has made very beautiful armatures. In fact, I think his intention was that this would be a sculpture in itself. It started off as an armature, and then he got so involved in it that it in fact landed up being just this very beautiful skeletal sculpture of a bird. And you can see that what he does then, he goes into a process of additive sculpting, where he starts adding in your repurposed plastic bags, shopping bags. And if you'll notice, I'm sure they'll get a closer shot just now, this little head that's very beautifully modeled over here is made from that Pratley epoxy putty that I was talking about earlier, which he let dry and then painted into. And then, here's a very interesting example as well, where he has taken lichen from trees and he has added it onto the armature to create this very interesting sculptural piece, this animal type hybrid piece. What's important here is the way the student has manipulated materials so that they are sufficiently transformed to become convincing within the sculptural context. Goes back to what I was talking about earlier. Okay, then just a few things I brought that were lying around at home as well. Here's some rather interesting beadwork, which is also additive in a way. And we often associate beadwork with either tourist art or more sort of craft-like approach, except that beads often can be used in a sculptural context, in a three-dimensional context, where you're starting to work with an object that takes up some sort of spatial aspect. Okay, there are a few more examples. So the important thing when working with wire and you're making an armature is to ensure that you use wire that is not going to hurt you or create too much of a challenge for you. I work primarily with aluminium wire, which is easily bendable. It's not too hard on your fingers. The galvanized wire, which is what he used here, that you find in hardware shops, is quite difficult to work with. And you will probably need either gloves and your wire tools, your wire cutter and your long nose pliers, and a pair of pliers to get the sort of detail that you're seeing in a sculpture such as this. Okay. All right, then, so when we're talking about assemblage and construction as well, you really are, I think one of the things that I always tell students when they're wanting to work with construction assemblage is spend more time trying to work out how you're going to put those materials together. And there are many different methods you can use. And we're now going into the world of unconventional sculptural processes. So things like, for example, sewing, wiring, welding, bolting, tying. And when I talk about tying, it's not only rope and string, but you can start to speak about cable ties as well. So all of these methods become important. And what I usually tell students is select the materials you're going to do and start making what we call maquettes. Before you start on the final sculpture, experiment with the materials, experiment with the technologies that you want to use to bring those materials together in small little three-dimensional experiments that we call maquettes. Now, just a very quick thing about a maquette. In a traditional sense, a maquette is usually a scaled down version of a much bigger sculptural application. So for example, if I'm wanting to make this little sculpture 25 meters high, I'm going to make it this size first. I'm going to take it to my client. I'm going to say, what do you think? Are you okay with this? He's going to sign, or she's going to sign it off, and then I'm going to go and produce it as a 25-meter high sculpture. That is traditionally understood to be a maquette. However, what we do here at UNISA is we try and use the idea of a maquette as a way to experiment and explore materials and construction technologies. Okay, cool.